Snow whipped sideways through the bitterroot air, sharp as flint and bitter with the kind of cold that gnawed at bones. Calder Red tugged Willa closer beneath his buffalo hide coat as they wove through the tight lanes of the winter trading post. Pine smoke tangled with the scent of roasted meat, and the low murmur of barter and laughter rose from bundled merchants hawking stew wool and tools. Horses shifted under blankets tied with rope, their breath steaming in heavy clouds. Calder's jaw clenched. He didn't like crowds, not since Sarah died. Not since every cheer and bark of laughter felt like a thing he no longer had claim to. But Willa, his daughter, had been buzzing for a week to come down the mountain trail to the December market. She'd braided her hair herself that morning, lopsided but proud, and begged for a peek at the tin soldiers in the window of Brogan's Mercantile. That's where she tugged him now toward glass frosted at the corners, behind which brass buttons and painted wood soldiers lined up in perfect rows. "Look, Papa," she breathed, pressing her mittened hands to the window. "That one's got a saber, just like your old stories." Calder managed a smile half-shadowed under his wide-brimmed hat. That one'd get himself killed carrying his blade that high. Willa laughed and leaned harder against the glass. He let her linger. God knew she didn't have much sweetness left in her days since the fever took Sarah. Then she stopped, went still. Her hand slid down the window. Calder's pulse lifted as he followed her gaze across the rutted, half-frozen street. There, beneath the warped awning of a shuttered cooper's shop, sat a boy. Small, hollow-eyed, barefoot in the snow. He looked no older than 8 or 9, maybe younger, knees pulled to his chest, arms wrapped around them. His shirt, too thin, too short, was worn through at the elbows. Dirt masked his face and the cracks of his skin, but not enough to cover the bluish cast of his lips. The world moved around him, as if he were invisible. A woman in a red wool cloak stepped over his outstretched leg without pause. A merchant shouted prices over his head, brushing snow from his booth mere inches from the boy's shoulder. But no one looked at him. Not once. Calder felt the weight of Willa's gaze before she turned her face up to him. Her voice came quiet, piercing. "Can we take him home, Papa? He's freezing and nobody sees him but me." Calder's heart lurched. He looked down at her furrowed brow, her storm-gray eyes, Sarah's eyes, and tried to speak. But the words tangled. What could he tell her? That kindness was dangerous, that the world didn't reward people who reached out to the broken. He swallowed. "Willa," he started. "He's just a boy," she whispered. "A boy like your brother, the one you told me about. The one who didn't come back." That cut deeper than she knew. Thomas had been 12 when he slipped down the cliff behind their old homestead. Calder had been 16, just old enough to carry the blame. Just old enough to know the guilt never left. "Stay here," he said low and tight. "Papa," I said, "stay." He crossed the street, boots crunching through a layer of slush and ice, his breath clouding heavy in the sharp air. The boy tensed as Calder approached, shrinking into himself like a cornered fox. His eyes, dark and wild, tracked every step. Calder crouched slowly, careful to keep his posture open, low, unthreatening. "You got a name, son?" The boy didn't answer. His gaze flicked down the street, measuring exits. When he finally spoke, it was a rasp. "Jonas," Jonas Calder repeated. "Name's Calder Red. That's my daughter Willa back there. She thinks you look hungry." Jonas's jaw clenched. That look, defiance buried under exhaustion, hit Calder hard. Pride still clung to the boy, even with his ribs showing. "When's the last time you ate?" The boy hesitated. "Couple days, maybe 3. Calder stood and extended a gloved hand. "There's a stew stall around the corner. Real food. Come on." "I ain't got money," Jonas muttered. I didn't ask if you did. Jonas stared at the hand like it was a trap. Then, slow as thawing molasses, he reached out and placed his tiny frozen fingers into Calder's. They were so cold, it made Calder's skin ache. Willa darted across the street to meet them. Her cheeks were pink, her eyes wide. "I'm Willa," she said cheerfully. "You're really dirty." Jonas looked down, quiet. "I know. That's okay," she said. "Papa's good at fixing things." Calder said nothing. The boy was lighter than a sack of oats, and just as quiet as they walked toward Fern Tallfeather's stew pot. Fern gave Calder a knowing look and ladled 3 generous bowls without a word. She handed them thick chunks of sourdough without charging extra. "Cold night," she said, her eyes sliding to Jonas. They sat near the fire pit where pine logs crackled in a steel drum. Jonas cupped the bowl in both hands, warming them first, then sipped slow, like afraid it'd vanish. Calder watched. The boy's cheeks began to flush pink again. Willa dug into her stew and talked about chickens reading and naming snowflakes. "Where's your people?" she asked. Jonas didn't lift his head. "Dead. Mine accident. Both of them." Calder's hand tightened on the bench. He knew that tone. Not grief, but the tired dullness of someone who'd told the story too many times and never once been heard. Jonas scraped the bottom of the bowl clean. "You can't sleep outside tonight," Willa said, frowning. "You'll freeze." "I got a place," he said. "Under the mill bridge." "That's not a place," she said, her voice rising. "That's outside," Willa Calder warned. She turned on him, tears brimming. "He'll die out there, Papa. You know he will." He didn't answer right away. The fire cracked between them. Jonas had gone still, watching him carefully, like waiting for the blow he expected. Calder sighed through his nose. "One night," he said, meeting Jonas's eyes. "You hear me one night. You'll sleep in the barn. It's warm." Jonas blinked fast. He didn't nod, just whispered, "Yes, sir." Willa let out a whoop and wrapped her arms around Calder's waist. He didn't move, just rested one hand on her back, then met Jonas's gaze. In those eyes, Calder didn't see a beggar. He saw a boy standing at the edge of something, and he had just stepped across. They rode home under a sky full of snow and silence, the mountain trail winding higher through frozen trees. Willa drifted asleep against Calder's chest. Behind him, Jonas clung to his coat. No sound but hooves in snow and the whisper of the wind. "How far?" Jonas asked. "Hour more." Then quiet again. "Why are you helping me?" Calder stared at the white trail ahead. "My daughter asked me to." He tightened his grip on the reins. "And that's enough." The lantern light swayed gently in the barn rafters as Calder pushed open the wooden door. The warmth inside, thick with the scent of hay and old pine, met them like an embrace. Willa stirred awake in his arms, rubbing her eyes with a sleepy hum. Jonas slid down from the mule without a sound, landing lightly despite his exhaustion. Calder pointed toward the stall on the left, freshly laid with hay and draped with an old wool blanket over the gate. "That'll be yours for the night," he said. "It's warmer than it looks." Jonas hesitated, staring up at him as if still unsure if this was real. "I've slept colder," the boy mumbled, stepping inside. Calder leaned on the rail, watching him settle in the corner, eyes scanning every shadow like he expected the ground to shift beneath him. "Folks been kind before?" Calder asked, his voice low. "Some. And then they wanted something." The lantern's glow flickered. Calder nodded slowly. "Not here. Nobody's asking for nothing." Jonas didn't respond, just curled his knees to his chest and turned his back. Willa appeared beside Calder, her braid loosened, and her arms wrapped around her favorite patchwork quilt. "Can he have mine?" I'll sleep in Mama's old shawl tonight." Before Calder could answer, she tiptoed across the straw and draped the blanket over Jonas's thin frame. The boy didn't speak, but he didn't push it off either. "Good night, Jonas," she whispered. He was quiet for a long moment, then so soft it nearly vanished. Night. As Willa climbed into the loft above Calder, threw a couple more logs into the barn stove, embers danced and popped, casting light and shadows up the wall. He took one long look back at the boy curled up like a secret, and then slipped out into the cold. The sky was navy stars, sharp and cold, as he walked toward the house. He felt a strange unease, not danger exactly, but the tremble of something shifting. Like a stone that had always been part of the path suddenly rolled underfoot. He didn't sleep well. Dreams of Thomas' wet boots, broken neck, the scream that never made it out of Calder's throat, spun behind his eyes. At first light, the rooster crowed sharp against the dawn. Calder pulled on his coat and boots and made his way back to the barn. He found Jonas already upstanding in the corner with Willa's quilt folded neatly at his feet. "You don't have to leave yet," Calder said, surprised. Jonas didn't look at him. "You said one night." "I did. But I figure it's only fair to do something back. For the food. The blanket." Calder rubbed the side of his jaw. "You want to work? I ain't lazy." "No, you're not." Jonas glanced up at him. The boy's posture was stiff, but behind it was the cautious hope of someone who'd never been trusted to stay. "There's wood to chop," Calder said. "Goats to feed. Coop needs shoveling. You take it on, breakfast's yours." Jonas gave one firm nod. By the time Willa skipped down the porch steps with her boots on the wrong feet, Jonas had already stacked half a cord of kindling and cleaned the coop in silence. His hands were red and raw, but he hadn't stopped. Willa offered him a biscuit smeared with apple butter. "You're fast," she said. "Faster than Papa, but not stronger." Calder lifted a brow but didn't argue. Jonas took the biscuit like it might vanish, but paused before eating. "Thank you." "You're welcome," Willa said brightly. "You got a middle name?" Jonas blinked. "Don't think so. I'll give you one then." "How about Storm, 'cause you came in out of the snow like one?" He snorted once. "Weird name. You're weird," she replied, grinning. From the porch, Rhett Thornback, Calder's old friend and neighbor from the next ridge over, pulled up on his chestnut mare. Rhett dismounted in one fluid motion, dark coat snapping in the breeze. "Calder," he called, tipping his hat. "Heard you came down to the post. Got yourself a new hand?" Calder glanced at Jonas, who had gone rigid. Found a boy freezing outside Brogan's, couldn't walk past him. Rhett's expression darkened. "You sure that's wise? Strays bring trouble. He got kin, no runaway then." "Don't matter." Rhett looked at Calder like he'd grown a second head. "You're not running a church, friend. You got Willa to think about." "I am thinking about her," Calder said firm. "She asked me to see him. I saw him." Rhett's gaze slid to Jonas, who now busied himself with the feed trough, back still stiff. "You know the Doyle boys have been sniffing around the valley, looking for someone." Calder's mouth tightened. What kind of someone didn't say? Just that they're missing something they think's theirs. That sat cold in Calder's chest. Rhett mounted again. "Just keep your eyes open, and maybe ask more questions." As he rode off, the wind stirred the trees like warning fingers. Back in the barn, Calder found Jonas scrubbing the feed buckets with a strip of burlap. "Got something I need to ask," he said, closing the stall door behind him. Jonas didn't look up. "About the Doyles," Calder blinked. "You know them two of 'em beat me last winter. Said I stole their bread. I didn't. You run from them, I ran from everything. Since the mine fell in, there wasn't nothing left. The boy finally met his eyes. I don't want to go back. Ever. Calder studied him for a long time. Then he took a deep breath. You can stay, but you'll earn it. You work, you eat. You lie, you leave. Jonas nodded, jaw trembling. Yes, sir. From the porch, Willa shouted, Papa, the goats are out again. Calder groaned. They hate fences. He turned back to Jonas. You ever wrestle a goat? Jonas's face broke into a faint, startled smile. No, sir, but I'd like to try. The sky was brighter now, full of wind and mountain sun. As they walked out together toward the chaos in the field, Calder felt the strange weight in his chest shift again. Not lighter, but different. For the first time in years, the silence around his homestead didn't feel hollow. It felt like it was listening. And something new was answering back. The snow had begun to melt in patches, revealing stubborn blades of winter grass poking through the white crust. Calder stood on the porch, arms crossed, watching Willa race up the hill, her laughter ringing like wind chimes. Jonas chased behind her slower, but smiling in a way that had taken weeks to appear. He was no longer just bones in a coat. He had filled out skin, less gray eyes, less hunted. But even as he laughed, Calder saw the quick flicker of caution still curled deep in his shoulders. Calder turned at the sound of boots crunching up the path. Well, I'll be damned, muttered a voice behind him. You got yourself a full house now. He didn't have to look to know it was Maeve Eddington, the traveling schoolteacher who passed through the valley every 2 weeks on muleback. She carried a rolled-up slate in one arm and a sack of ink bottles that clinked when she walked. You show up like the weather, Maeve, Calder said with a grin. And you're just as ornery, she shot back, her eyes sliding toward the children. Willa's grown since last I saw her. She has. And that's Jonas. Maeve raised a brow. Yours no. Just mine enough. She gave him a long look, then walked past him toward the porch, waving at Willa. Any child under your roof is your child, Calder Bray. You remember that. As they settled at the kitchen table, Willa dragged Jonas inside, chattering about how she could beat him at spelling, and Jonas pretending he didn't care. Calder leaned against the doorway, watching, as Maeve pulled out her slates and passed them around. What's this one mean? Jonas asked, pointing to a curved letter on the slate. Maeve looked up, surprised. You don't know your letters. He shook his head, tense. I can read, he added quickly, defensive. I just never learned the fancy way. Maeve softened. Well, let's teach you proper then. Willa scooted closer. I'll help. Jonas looked like he wanted to shrink. I don't want help. It's not help, she said, nudging his shoulder. It's just being next to someone. Calder watched from the doorframe. Willa had never had a brother, but she'd taken to Jonas like she'd always been waiting for one. Maeve stayed through the morning, teaching, sharing cornbread, and swapping weather news. As she packed up to leave, she pulled Calder aside. He's scared of something. Not just the Doyles. I know. You can't fix fear with chores and soup. No. But I can keep it warm, feed it, and make it think it's safe long enough to breathe again. Maeve placed a hand on his arm. You're a good man, Calder Bray. Even when you don't want to be. By late afternoon, the sun burned pale behind the ridge and the sky turned the color of old linen. Jonas and Willa sat on the porch steps, carving shapes into soft pine with pocket knives. Calder was chopping kindling out back when he heard the sound of a horse approaching fast and urgent. He stepped out just as a rider burst through the trees, Deputy Eli Corman, the sheriff's right hand. Dust and frost clung to his coat. You got a moment? Bray Calder nodded. What is it? Rhett said you took in a boy? Slim dark hair, maybe 12, Calder crossed his arms. That right. There's trouble. That Doyle family, 3 of them came down from east of San Miguel. Said the kid's a thief. Said he took something from them. Important. Calder narrowed his eyes. They tell you what? No. Just that it's theirs, and they want him back. Sheriff says it's your right to shelter him, but if something was stolen, we'll need the truth. Behind them, Jonas stood silently in the doorway, face pale. He'd heard everything. I'll talk to him, Calder said. Eli tipped his hat. Do that, and watch your back. Doyles aren't known for patience. Calder waited until Eli rode off before stepping inside. Jonas sat by the hearth, staring into the fire. Something you want to tell me? Calder asked, voice low. Jonas's mouth twisted. They think I stole it. I didn't. I swear. What is it? Jonas was silent for so long, Calder thought he wouldn't answer. A locket, he whispered. Gold. Had a picture of a little girl in it. Calder leaned against the wall. And you didn't take it? No. I found it. In the snow outside their wagon. I kept it 'cause I don't know. It reminded me of my sister. You have a sister, had Jonas muttered. She died in the fire, the one that started after the mine collapsed. Calder rubbed the back of his neck. You could have brought it here. Told me. I didn't think you'd let me stay if you knew. You're not staying here on account of what you did. You're staying 'cause of who you are. Jonas turned sharply. And who's that somebody who survived hell and still remembered to share his bread with my daughter? That's who. Jonas's eyes shimmered. He looked away fast, blinking hard. They're gonna come for me, he said. Maybe. But I'm not sending you anywhere. Jonas stood up, fists clenched. They're dangerous. So am I, Calder said. Outside, the sun dipped lower, painting the fields in cold gold. That night, Jonas couldn't sleep. He lay in the hayloft beside Willa, listening to the wind scrape against the barn. He clutched the locket in his hand. It was warm from being hidden in his coat. The picture inside was cracked, but the girl's face looked kind. Jonas imagined she would have liked Willa. At some point, he crept down the ladder and stood in the doorway of Calder's cabin. The lantern was still lit inside. Calder sat by the fire, whittling a piece of cedar. Jonas held out the locket. I want to give it back, he said. Even if they lie about me, I don't want it hanging over me. Calder looked up, took the locket gently, and nodded. You're doing the right thing. They won't care. No, Calder agreed. But you will. In the quiet that followed, Calder said, We'll ride into town tomorrow. Give it to the sheriff. Let him handle the Doyles. Jonas exhaled slowly. Will you come with me? Calder stood, placing a firm hand on the boy's shoulder. Not just with you. I'll be in front. Jonas nodded, eyes flickering with something like peace. As he turned back toward the barn, Calder looked out across the night-soaked land. A storm was gathering, he could feel it, but in the boy's steady footsteps there was something else, a choice. And Calder had already made his. The sun barely crested the distant ridgeline when Calder saddled his horse. Frost clung to the leather, stiffening under his fingers as he adjusted the reins. Jonas stood near the barn, silent, dressed in a coat too big and boots that still clomped awkwardly when he walked. Willa stood beside him, arms crossed tightly over her chest. You don't have to go, she said. Jonas didn't answer. Calder walked up, handing him a biscuit wrapped in cloth. Eat. Jonas took it, but didn't unwrap it. I'm not scared, he muttered. Never said you were. Willa stepped closer. You give it back, then you come home. That's how it works. Jonas met her eyes, and for a moment the fear cracked beneath something else, something like hope. He gave a short nod. Calder watched the exchange, then helped Jonas mount the second horse, Buck, an old but sure-footed gelding. They rode in silence for a long stretch. Snow melted in slow trickles off the rocks. The air smelled like thawing earth and pine sap. Calder watched Jonas's hands grip the reins too tightly. He wanted to tell him to relax, but he didn't. The boy needed his own way through this. When they reached town, the stillness shattered. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer echoed off wood walls. Folks bustled down the street, nodding to Calder with cautious respect. He was known, perhaps feared, but never ignored. They dismounted in front of the sheriff's office. Jonas hesitated, the locket gripped in his palm like it might dissolve if he let go. "You sure?" Calder asked. Jonas didn't answer. He stepped through the door, the bell jingling above him. Sheriff Walton looked up from his desk, his mustache twitching at the sight of them. "Bray," he said. "Jonas." The name landed heavy in the room. Calder spoke first. "He's here to return what wasn't his." Jonas stepped forward and placed the locket on the desk. "I didn't steal it. I found it. But it's theirs." Walton studied him, then picked up the locket and turned it over in his fingers. "They've been shouting from rooftops that you're a thief," Walton said. "But this tells me something different." A voice interrupted from the doorway. "Tells me he's trying to worm his way out of what he did." 3 men entered the Doyles' shoulders wide with menace, coats stiff with trail dust. The leader, Silas Doyle, had a hawkish face and eyes like river ice. "That locket belonged to my niece," Silas growled. "He ran off with it and near set fire to our wagon." "That's not true," Jonas said, voice rising. "The fire started when your brother knocked over the lantern." "I tried to help. You tried to help yourself," barked the second Doyle, stepping closer. Calder moved between them, calm but solid as stone. "You raise a hand to him, you'll answer to me." Silas laughed bitterly. "You taking in strays now, Bray? Or is this another one of your charity causes?" "He's under my roof, and that makes him mine," Calder said coldly. Walton raised a hand. "Enough. This is my office. Now, unless one of you has a law broken, you can prove in writing or in witness, you best take your accusations and leave them at the door." Silas pointed a shaking finger at Jonas. "That boy's a curse. Mark my words, he brings ruin where he walks." Maybe Walton said. "But today he brought back what wasn't his. That tells me more than your threats." Silas stared at Calder, his eyes full of something darker than rage, something personal. Then he spat on the floor and turned on his heel. The Doyles stormed out, boots echoing down the plank steps. Jonas stood frozen. Calder put a hand on his shoulder. "You did right. They won't let it go," Jonas whispered. "No," Calder said, "but neither will I." They left the sheriff's office and walked into the weak afternoon sun. A few townsfolk whispered as they passed. Calder ignored them, but Jonas flinched at every sideways glance. As they hit the edge of town, a familiar voice called out, "Mr. Bray, wait!" It was Dr. Malcolm Reyes, the aging but sharp-eyed physician who had once delivered Willa. He rode a mule slower than a thought, and wore a hat too big for his thin head. He caught up to them, face flushed. "Calder. Boy. Sorry to stop you, but I overheard something in the tavern. Silas Doyle's looking for more men. Said he's got business unfinished with you." Calder's jaw clenched. "He'll have to get in line. He's dangerous," Dr. Reyes warned. "He's got nothing to lose but a grudge." Jonas shifted beside him. Calder gave the doctor a nod and thanked him. They rode on in silence. As the valley opened up before them, Calder saw smoke in the distance, too much to be from a stove, too dark to be from brush burning. He kicked his horse into a gallop, heart pounding. Jonas clung to his reins, riding fast behind him. When they reached the cabin, the barn door was hanging crooked on its hinges. Smoke drifted from a scorched hay bale. Willa stood by the fence, pale but unhurt, clutching a rifle that looked too big for her hands. "I saw them," she said. "I saw them coming." Her voice trembled, but she didn't cry. "They threw fire at the barn. I shot in the air and they ran." Calder jumped down, inspecting the damage miner. "But the message was clear. They were here," Jonas whispered. Calder turned to him, eyes steel. "Yes, and we'll be ready when they come again." Willa looked at Jonas. "I told you. You come back. And now you did." Jonas stared at the scorched wood, then at the horizon where the smoke had blown. His hands shook, but only a little. "They're not going to stop," he said. "No," Calder replied. "But neither are we." Inside the house, Calder placed the locket on the mantel beside a small carved horse Willa had made, a symbol of truth given back, a symbol of something earned. Outside, night crept in cold and silent, wrapping the valley in shadow. But inside the cabin, the fire burned strong, and every breath that rose in that space was a vow, a silent declaration. The boy stays. And this time, they would fight to keep him. "You didn't just save that boy from the Doyles," Malcolm said, voice low. "You saved yourself from disappearing." The wind that swept through the valley the next morning carried the sour bite of ash and an uneasy silence. Calder stood by the charred barn boots, sunk in wet earth eyes, scanning every broken slat. What little damage the fire had done to the structure didn't match the weight it left in his chest. The fire wasn't meant to destroy, it was meant to warn, and Calder had never been a man who took kindly to threats. Willa sat on the porch steps, chin tucked into her knees. Jonas was beside her, his back straight, but his eyes wandering, caught between guilt and vigilance. Calder watched them for a long moment, then walked over, his hands dirty and splintered from pulling down scorched boards. "We ride into town today," he said. "Gonna talk to Malcolm. Get his eyes on you both. Make sure no smoke got into your lungs." Willa didn't protest. Jonas didn't look up. "Then we fix that fence," Calder added. "And after that, we start working on the mare's pen. You still gonna build that?" Willa asked. Calder nodded. More reason now than ever. The doctor's house was a slanted thing with more books than furniture, and a wide porch that creaked louder than the front door. Calder knocked once. Malcolm opened it with a hand towel over his shoulder and a mug of something herbal in the other hand. "Well, if it ain't the valley's trouble magnet," he said, stepping aside. "Come on in." He checked Willa first. His fingers gentle on her neck, his voice light as he asked about sleep and appetite. Then he turned to Jonas. The boy flinched slightly at the touch on his chest, but Malcolm pretended not to notice. "Heartbeat steady. Breath's clean. You're tough, boy." Jonas gave a thin smile. After the examination, Calder sat at Malcolm's cluttered table while the kids played with a jar of marbles left forgotten on the windowsill. "You got more trouble coming," Malcolm said flatly, pouring tea into a chipped cup and setting it in front of Calder. "Doyles haven't been this stirred since their father lost half his land to the government reclamation." "They tried to burn my barn with my daughter in it," Calder replied. "This ain't about land anymore." "No, it's not," Malcolm agreed. "It's about pride. Yours. Theirs. And now that boy's caught in the middle." Calder stared into the steam of his tea. "I wasn't looking to start a war." Malcolm chuckled dryly. "Funny how often we say that after it's already begun." The door creaked again. Calder turned as Jonas stepped away from the window, jaw clenched. "There's a man across the street, watching the house." Calder rose. Malcolm didn't move. Tall red shirt, black hat, Jonas nodded. "Silas's cousin. Name's Truitt. He's a coward, but he likes reporting back to people with meaner eyes than his." Calder moved to the window, watching Truitt pretend to read a paper on a bench outside the general store. I should have run him off that first day. Malcolm shook his head. You did better. You gave that boy something to believe in. That burns worse than fire to men like Silas. Calder turned back to him. Why does it feel like this ain't about Jonas anymore? Because it never was, Malcolm said. You didn't just save that boy from the Doyles, you saved yourself from disappearing, from becoming the man who stopped mattering when his wife died. Calder stiffened. Malcolm didn't apologize. You know I'm right. Calder said nothing. Instead, he crossed the room and opened the door. We're heading back. Come on. The ride home was quiet. Willa hummed a song from her childhood. Jonas rode with his eyes constantly scanning the trees. Calder didn't rush them. His mind churned like river water behind a dam. Something had shifted deep in him, something old and unspoken. At the cabin, the sun hung low. Shadows fell long and sharp across the field. Calder unsaddled the horses while Willa chopped vegetables for stew. Jonas, without being asked, began stacking kindling. He didn't speak, but his movements were purposeful, like each stick placed was a stake against the past. Later, as they sat around the table, Calder poured 3 bowls and slid them across. Jonas hesitated, then spoke quietly. I used to think the worst part of running was being hungry, but now I think it's not having anyone who cares if you make it through the night. Willa looked at him, her spoon halfway to her mouth. You made it through, she said softly. And now you got us. The boy didn't respond, but he didn't look away either. After supper, Calder stepped outside, pipe in hand. The stars blinked through a veil of thin clouds. The wind was shifting, changing from west to north, a colder front coming. He didn't trust what it carried. A rustle behind him drew his attention. It was Jonas bundled in Willa's old coat. You ever scared? The boy asked. All the time. Jonas blinked in surprise. Difference is, I know what to do with it now. What's that? Use it. Let it remind you what matters. They stood in silence a while longer. Inside, the cabin glowed with lamplight and the warmth of something deeper than flame. Calder looked down at Jonas. Tomorrow we start training that wild mare. She's stubborn, needs a steady hand. Jonas's brow furrowed. Why me? Because you're the only one here stubborn enough to match her. A faint smile crept across the boy's face. Behind them, the sound of hooves echoed faintly down the far ridge. Calder turned, heart hammering. He counted 2 riders moving slow but deliberate, watching the cabin from afar before turning back into the trees. He didn't say a word, just stepped inside and slid the rifle from above the doorframe. Jonas followed, his eyes wide but steady. The wind howled through the cracks in the shutters, but inside the cabin they were ready. This wasn't over, not by a long stretch. That boy's scars ain't just on the outside, Malcolm warned. If you ain't ready to carry some of his ghosts, best leave him be. The morning cracked open with frost glazing the windows and a silence too still to trust. Calder stirred the embers in the hearth, the last of the coals popping like tired breath. Willa snored softly on the cot behind him. Jonas had taken to sleeping on a makeshift mattress by the door, insisting he wanted to hear trouble coming. Calder hadn't argued, though the boy's nightmares told him the real reason. He stepped outside, letting the cold slap him awake. The snow had crusted hard overnight, crunching under his boots. The ridge where he'd seen the 2 riders last night was bare now, but their presence hadn't vanished. It clung to the trees, to the wind's nervous whisper. Jonas joined him a few minutes later, rubbing sleep from his eyes and hugging Willa's coat tighter around himself. They were here again, Calder said, without looking over. Riders, Same two, I'm guessing. Doyle's or their dogs. Jonas stared at the ridge, silent. You ever trained a horse before? Calder asked, abrupt. Jonas shook his head. Well, Calder said, tossing him a pair of gloves, today, you start. The mare, a fiery sorrel Willa had named Ginger Snap, reared the moment they opened the gate. Her eyes rolled wild with the kind of fear born from too many hands breaking instead of bonding. Jonas froze when she charged toward the fence, then pivoted fast as a storm front. Don't show her your fear, Calder warned. She'll feed on it. I ain't scared, Jonas muttered. Calder raised a brow. Then you're lying. They spent the next few hours circling her, not touching, just watching. Calder taught him how to read her body, the twitch of an ear, the way her nostrils flared her shifting weight. By midday, the mare still hadn't let Jonas get within 10 feet. Patience is its own kind of strength, Calder said, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder. You rush her, you teach her the world don't wait. But here we do. Jonas nodded, lips pressed tight. After lunch, they sat by the corral, sharing jerky and bread. Willa watched from the porch sketchpad in her lap, eyes flitting between the boy and the horse. She had a quiet way of seeing like her mama had, noticing the small things that men stomped right over. Jonas broke the silence. She's like me. Calder looked at him. Snaps fast. Don't trust easy. Yeah, Calder said. But she's still worth the time. The boy glanced up, unsure if that was about the horse or him. That night, after Willa was asleep, Calder rode into town alone, leaving Jonas behind with a loaded shotgun and instructions to bar the door after him. It wasn't ideal, but Malcolm had sent word earlier through a farmhand, urgent. And when Malcolm said urgent, it wasn't gossip. The doctor's lantern lit up the window like a beacon. Calder tied off his horse and knocked. Malcolm opened the door, eyes bloodshot, shirt stained. You look like hell, Calder muttered. Malcolm stepped aside. Just delivered twins out past Crooked Rock. What's your excuse? You said it was urgent. Malcolm poured 2 fingers of whiskey into a chipped cup. It is. They sat in the kitchen, a fire crackling low in the belly of the stove. Malcolm slid a letter across the table. The paper was crumpled, the seal broken sloppily. Calder read, his jaw set. School board, Malcolm said. Official complaint. Doyle's filed it. Accusing you of endangering minors. Claim the boy's violent, unstable. They're trying to take him, Calder said. Malcolm nodded. And they'll use the law to do it. I'll fight it. You better. But you need to understand something. Malcolm leaned in. That boy's scars ain't just on the outside. If you ain't ready to carry some of his ghosts, best leave him be. I ain't leaving him. You say that now? I mean it. Malcolm stared at him, then nodded once. Then get ready. They're gonna come for him with papers and rifles. One'll bleed you. The other'll bury you. Calder rode back, fast anger thudding in his chest like hooves. Jonas met him at the door, face pale. I saw someone, the boy said, out near the west line. He didn't come close, just watched. Did he say anything? Jonas shook his head, but he whistled. 3 notes, same ones Doyle boys used to use when they'd corner me in the barn. Calder's stomach twisted. You sure? Jonas nodded. I remember. Calder stepped inside, grabbed his rifle, and walked the fence line until dawn. No sound, no prints, just shadows and the long ache of waiting. The next morning, Calder put Jonas back with the mare. You gonna let one whistle keep you off track? Jonas hesitated, then shook his head. He climbed the fence and stood inside the ring. The mare watched him. This time she didn't bolt. He took a step forward, then another. She didn't move. Jonas extended a hand, fingers trembling, breath held. The mare stepped closer, ears twitching, neck stretched out. Their noses almost touched. Then she turned away, trotting a slow circle around him, watching him, but not running. Calder exhaled. That's trust starting to grow right there. Jonas smiled faintly, eyes glassy. They worked in silence the rest of the day. That night, Calder sat by the fire with Willa Jonas already asleep by the hearth. "You think we're safe here?" she asked. "No," Calder said honestly, "but we're not alone anymore. That counts for something." A crack echoed through the hills, sharp, distant, unmistakable. A rifle. Calder was on his feet in an instant, grabbing the lantern and heading outside. Another shot rang out, this one closer. Willa came to the door. Papa Calder looked back at her. "Stay with your brother. Lock the door." His voice was calm, but inside him a storm was rising. Someone had crossed the line tonight, and Calder intended to send them back one way or another. "He's not a stray mutt for your pocketbook," Doyle Calder growled. "He's a boy with a soul, and that soul ain't for sale." The blood-orange light of early dawn hadn't yet broken over the horizon when Calder reached the edge of the ridge. The smell of gunpowder clung faint in the air. Snow crusted the tree limbs, brittle and thin, every branch a possible sniper's perch. Calder crouched low, the butt of his rifle snug against his shoulder, eyes scanning for movement. A crow lifted from a tree with a screech, but there was no other sign of life. The shot had been a warning, and a message. He returned home to find Willa kneeling by the stove, spooning hot grits into bowls, her back stiff with nerves. Jonas sat at the table, his eyes glued to the window, his body rigid like a coil wound too tight. Calder laid the rifle against the wall, but didn't bother taking off his coat. "Willa, I need you to head into town today." She turned to him, frowning. "Why, I need you to talk to Miss Lorna at the schoolhouse. Ask her if she's heard anything from the board. If Doyle's trying to stir trouble there." Willa's eyes narrowed. "You think he's coming after Jonas through the school, I know it." She nodded once. "I'll take the wagon. Jonas can come too." Calder looked to the boy. Jonas had gone pale. "I'd rather stay." "No," Calder said. "You're going." Jonas flinched, but Willa touched his shoulder gently. "We'll be all right," she whispered. "Stick close. I won't let you out of my sight." It wasn't ideal, but Calder needed them out of the house, just in case Doyle came calling in person. They left mid-morning, the snow slush under the wagon wheels. Calder stayed behind, sharpening his blades, reloading rounds, reinforcing the locks on the doors. He didn't like turning the cabin into a fortress, but some men didn't understand lines until they were forced to choke on them. Late afternoon brought hoofbeats on the gravel. Slow, unhurried, confident. Calder stood on the porch, rifle slung loose at his side, as Silas Doyle dismounted, his slick city boots crunching in the dirty snow. He wore a long camel coat, fur-lined and far too fine for this part of Montana. Two other men, brutes with dead eyes, remained on horseback behind him. Calder's jaw ticked. "Didn't think you'd come yourself," Calder said. "I like to handle things personally," Doyle replied, flashing that politician's smile. "Just a friendly visit." Calder snorted. "You don't do friendly." Doyle looked past him toward the barn. Nice spread. Clean. Quiet. Almost domestic. Calder didn't move. Doyle reached into his coat pocket. Calder's grip on the rifle tensed. Doyle pulled out a thick envelope. 10,000, he said, tossing it at Calder's feet. "That's 5 more than you paid for this land. You can take the cash and be out by spring. I'll even throw in transport." Calder didn't flinch. "I'm not selling." Doyle stepped closer. "You know that boy don't belong here. Folks are talking. Papers got drawn up. You're keeping a ward you've no right to. You're interfering with state placement." Calder's voice was quiet but firm. He's not a stray mutt for your pocketbook, Doyle. He's a boy with a soul, and that soul ain't for sale. Doyle chuckled coldly. You think you're noble. But the truth is, you're just a tired old man trying to save a world that doesn't exist anymore. Better than building one on broken backs. Doyle's smile slipped. You've made an enemy of men with power, Calder. You protect that boy, you invite a storm on everyone under your roof. Calder stepped down from the porch, slowly, his boots sinking into the snow. He stood inches from Doyle, close enough to see the lines around his eyes tighten. I've been in storms before. Doyle's men shifted uneasily. Without a word, Calder turned and walked back inside, slamming the door behind him. The envelope of cash lay untouched in the snow until the wind blew it into the mud. Willa and Jonas returned near dusk. Her face was drawn, and Jonas looked rattled. Calder met them at the barn. What happened? He asked. Lorna was spooked, Willa said. Wouldn't say much, but I saw Doyle's men in town. Same ones from last time, and she hesitated. Jonas froze outside the post office. Said he saw someone. Calder looked at the boy, who nodded, teeth clenched. It was Clay Jonas, said quietly. One of the men who used to help Doyle. Willa's hand found the boy's shoulder. He didn't shrug it off. That night, Calder took watch while they slept. He sat on the porch, firelight flickering behind him, the shotgun across his lap. His breath fogged in the cold, mixing with the distant howls of coyotes and the crackling of frozen trees shifting. Hours passed. Then a rustle near the tree line. He stood, rifle-raised, body still, but it was just a silhouette hurrying toward the house. As it neared, he saw the scarf, bright red wool. It was June, the baker's wife, her face flushed and tear-streaked. Calder, she panted, they took my nephew. The Doyles. Said it was legal placement. But he screamed for me. Calder pulled her inside, sat her down. Willa woke and made tea. Did you see where they took him? June nodded, trembling. Old boarding shack by the mill. Same place they kept the others before transport. Jonas had crept into the room, silent as breath. He was pale, shaking. I know that place, he said. Calder met his eyes. You been there? Jonas nodded slowly. It's where they kept me before the auction. His voice cracked, but he forced the rest out. It's where they broke the others. Calder knelt in front of him. You don't have to go back there. But I do, Jonas whispered. They'll keep doing this. To others. Like me. Willa's eyes filled. June gripped her cup with white knuckles. Calder stood and shouldered his coat. Then we ride before dawn. Jonas didn't hesitate. I'm coming with you. They called us cargo, Jonas whispered. But we remembered our names. The sky was a bruised sheet of gray as Calder, Jonas, and Willa rode toward the mill. The snow had hardened overnight, crusting the trail in slick patches that made the horses wary. Wind scraped across the land like a blade howling low through the pines. The sun hadn't risen yet, and Calder didn't want to wait for it. He glanced over his shoulder. Willa rode with her back straight, jaw set. She hadn't argued when he told her she was coming. Jonas sat on his pony behind them, smaller than his resolve. The boy had packed his slingshot and a small hunting knife in his coat. Calder hadn't taken it from him. Sometimes carrying a weapon was about more than defense. As they neared the edge of Doyle's property, Calder raised a hand. They stopped behind a thicket of trees overlooking the dilapidated shack near the abandoned mill. The place looked dead from a distance, gray wood, leaning with age windows boarded up with rusted nails. But Calder saw the faintest trail of smoke from the chimney. Someone was inside. Willa dismounted, first tying her reins to a low branch. There's a path around back. We used to come through here as kids when the mill still ran. Calder nodded. You and I go through the front. Jonas, you wait until we're in, then go around back. You see anyone try to run, yell? Jonas looked afraid. Not of failing someone else. Calder crouched to his level, gripping the boy's shoulder. You know this place. That gives us the edge. You remember what you told me, Jonas swallowed. I remember everything. Then they can't take that from you again. They moved quickly, crossing open ground to the porch. Willa tapped twice on the frame, an old local signal from childhood days. Calder kicked the door open before the echo faded. The room was dim, heated by a single potbelly stove that cast a weak orange glow. It smelled of kerosene and sweat. A man jumped to his feet from a cot in the corner, Clay Doyle's enforcer. His hand went for his hip, but Calder had the rifle trained on him before the gun cleared leather. Don't, Calder growled. Behind Clay, 2 boys no older than 10 scrambled to the back of the room, their eyes wide and hollow. Another lay asleep under a blanket on the floor. No, not asleep. Too still. Willa rushed forward, checking his pulse. She shook her head slowly, eyes dark with grief. Calder stepped closer. Where is Doyle? Clay's lip curled. You think he'd dirty his hands here? Willa stood, rage flushing her face. You're transporting children in winter with no heat, no food, no care. He's not dirtying his hands. He's burying yours in the mud. Clay didn't flinch. Outside, Jonas slipped through the back, the creak of the broken hinge nearly masked by the wind. The 2 younger boys looked up at him. Recognition flickered in their eyes. Jonas stepped into the light face hard. They called us cargo, he whispered. But we remembered our names. Clay turned to him, surprised. You, he said. I thought you thought Doyle owned me, Jonas said. But I ran. And I remember what you did. Clay reached for the gun again. The window behind him shattered. Calder's bullet missed by inches, taking out the frame beside Clay's head. Clay dropped his weapon. Try again, Calder warned, and I aimed center. Willa took the boys outside, wrapping them in her coat. Jonas stood over Clay, fists clenched. You told me I was lucky, Jonas said. You said I'd be placed with a family that wouldn't beat me if I kept my mouth shut. Clay laughed bitterly. And look where you ended up. On a farm with a broken vet and a woman who plays house. Jonas didn't move. Better than being bought. Calder reached for the rope near the stove and tied Clay's hands behind his back. We'll take him to Sheriff Boyd. Let the law see what Doyle's people are doing. Law's on Doyle's payroll, Clay muttered. He'll walk. Willa returned, holding the smallest child in her arms. Then we make noise. We write letters. We find papers. We speak names. Calder's mind raced. He knew Doyle worked in shadows in places where children disappeared without a trace. But now they had faces, witnesses, a body. Clay's silence wouldn't hold forever, not when prison meant losing the protection Doyle offered. They led the children back to the wagon. Jonas helped lift the smallest into the seat, his hands gentle. Willa brushed snow from the other's hair, whispering soft encouragement. Calder rode behind with Clay tied to the saddle horn, his horse tethered to Calder's. At the edge of town, they were met with stares. Word had already spread. June met them at the church steps, eyes widening at the boys in the wagon. Lord above, she whispered. You found them. We found more than that, Calder said. She stepped aside, opening the door. Inside, Sister Marin rushed to lay out blankets, bringing warm broth from the kitchen. The boys didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their silence spoke volumes Doyle could never drown. Sheriff Boyd arrived not long after, flanked by 2 deputies. Calder explained everything, voice clear and even. Clay sat slumped in a chair, blood dried on his temple from where he'd fallen during the ride. Boyd scratched his head. This is bigger than local jurisdiction. Then take it up the ladder, Calder said. Or I will. Willa stepped forward. We'll swear affidavits. So will the kids when they're ready. June saw what Doyle did. The sheriff looked between them all, then at Jonas, who hadn't spoken since they arrived. Finally, Boyd gave a slow nod. I'll file the paperwork. But be ready. Doyle won't go quiet. As night fell over the church, Calder stood on the steps watching shadows stretch long across the snow. Jonas joined him silent for a while before speaking. They called us cargo, he repeated more to himself than anyone else. But I'm still here. Calder didn't look away. You're more than here. You're fighting. Jonas nodded slowly. So are they now. The wind picked up again sharp and cold, but this time it didn't cut quite as deep. He took my hand and gave me his name. Ain't nobody taking me now, not without a fight. The snow along the main street had turned to a thin gray slush pushed into piles beside the boardwalk. Calder rode Jonas in on Buck, the old gelding, stepping carefully through the mud. Willa followed behind on her mare's scarf wrapped tight around her face. Folks stopped and stared, not in anger, in curiosity. In the particular way a frontier town watched trouble unfold. Calder dismounted in front of the courthouse and helped Jonas down. The boy wore borrowed gloves and a coat that fit him better now. He had filled out some in the last weeks, still thin, but no longer breakable as glass. You ready, son? Calder asked. Jonas nodded. Yes, sir. Inside, Judge Ira Burnett waited at his desk, papers stacked high like winter cordwood. Fern Tallfeather stood quietly near the window. Otis Lantry beside her, his one good eye tracking everything. June had promised to meet them there too, and she did, stepping in with a basket of muffins and a smile too bright for her nerves. Burnett looked at Jonas and asked, You understand what this means, boy? Adoption papers. Family papers. I do, Jonas said. And you consent? Jonas didn't hesitate. Yes, sir. Calder felt relief wash through him. The law could be a tool when handled right, like a rifle cleaned with care. Burnett nodded and slid the documents toward Calder. Sign here, then here again. Calder took the pen in shaking fingers and signed his name, a vow in ink. When Jonas stepped forward to add his own scrawled signature, Calder realized the boy was trembling harder than he was. Scared, Willa asked softly. Little. That's okay. Not for long, Jonas whispered, staring at the page where his new name sat in careful letters. He looked up at Calder. He gave me his name. That makes me yours now, right? Yeah, Calder said. Makes you mine. Fern Tallfeather stepped forward. I'll swear witness that he's been under your roof, that he's cared for proper. So will I, June added. Burnett stamped the papers with his seal. The thud of the gavel echoed across the room like a thing settled. At least for now. Outside the courthouse, they were met with congratulations. The town preacher clasped Calder's hand and promised to speak on the matter come Sunday. The banker said he'd testify if needed. Otis Lantry gripped the boy's shoulder and muttered, You stick close to Bray, you'll be fine. But Clay Reyes, the company man, had been seen again in town recruiting. That meant Dutton and Doyle wouldn't be going quiet anytime soon. The sheriff warned Calder that documentation was being filed against Consolidated Copper and its questionable financial practices. Public opinion was turning like a slow storm front. That helped, but not enough to keep intruders away for good. Fern Tallfeather promised to spread word of the adoption across the territory. She did. and folks began to believe that a child's place was not on the back of a mine wagon, but under a cabin roof. As the sun climbed higher, Calder saddled Jonas and Willa and headed back into town to finish the process. The sheriff greeted Jonas by his new name and grinned. "Good to see you smiling." "Not much choice now," Jonas said. "I think you'll find you've got plenty," the sheriff replied. Calder rode back toward the cabin as night fell. Jonas and Willa ran out to meet him, faces flushed and eager. He showed them Judge Burnett's temporary protective order. Jonas struggled to read the fancy legal language, but Calder's explanation made it clear. "It means you're staying officially," he said. "Staying legally until everything's processed." Jonas blinked. "Adoption's going through, it is." His face lit up like sunrise on snow. "Papa, you got me," Jonas whispered fiercely. "You got me now, and I'm not going back. Ain't nobody taking me now, not without a fight." Willa threw her arms around him, both of them hugging Calder at once. The seed of hope grew stronger in Calder's chest. Later at the cabin, Calder reinforced Jonas's bed, lining up Boots by the door and setting a pot of biscuits on the coals. Jonas slept on a real mattress, now quieter than a thought. The boy's nightmares still crept in sometimes, but Willa's reading and Fern's quiet assurances helped him breathe easier. As they sat around the hearth that night, Fern Tallfeather joined them with a pot of herbal tea, and Otis brought a sack of fresh venison. "We stand with you," they both said. A quiet vow of community support. But in the far distance, someone whistled again from the tree line. 3 sharp notes. Jonas froze. Calder didn't move, just reached for the rifle above the door and said quietly, "You're safe here, boy." Jonas nodded, eyes flickering with nerves. "Papa, what if they come back?" Willa asked softly. "They will," Calder said honestly. "But we'll be ready." The wind howled through the trees outside. Jonas sat by his bed, carving shapes into the cabin beam, with his pocket knife staring at the horizon where shadows stretched long. "I'll stand with you," Jonas said. Calder's voice was calm. "That's how families are built." The picture on the mantel was cracked but glowing in firelight. The boy had his name now. But Cyrus Gant had been seen again on the ridge, and that meant the real fight was only just beginning. "You came to take him back, then you'll have to go through me, and I don't reckon you're ready for that." The knock came just after dawn, sharp and certain against the cabin door. Calder had been up already, splitting kindling out, back steam rising from his breath as the axe cracked through wood. Willa stirred the ashes from the night's fire while Jonas, still blinking sleep from his eyes, pulled on his boots. Calder opened the door, slow. And there he stood. Cyrus Gant. Tall, lean, a face carved from stone and shaded with malice. Behind him loomed 2 other men, strangers, but built like they'd wrestled debt and won. Suits sharp enough to cut boots, polished and eyes cold. Company men. Not ranch hands. Jonas went rigid. The boy stood in the shadows behind Willa, his body halfway behind a kitchen chair. "Morning," Cyrus said, as though he were a neighbor asking for coffee. Calder didn't answer. "I'm here for the boy." "No, you're not." Cyrus smirked. "You ain't got the right to tell me that. I've got a judge's stamp, his signature on the adoption. I've got witnesses, documents, the sheriff on notice, and the Lord himself watching this door." "What have you got?" Blood, Cyrus growled. "I've got blood, and that trumps paper." "You lost the right to that blood the moment you sold him like a mule to the mine," Calder shot back. "You're not his kin. You're just a name that broke him." The men behind Cyrus shifted. One looked toward Jonas, narrowing his eyes, calculating. "We have legal papers removal orders," he said. "There's a claim in the county that the adoption was fraudulent. Our employer, Consolidated Copper, is prepared to petition for custody. Calder stepped outside the cabin door, still open behind him. The wind rolled in bitter across the plain, but he didn't flinch. You came to take him back. Calder's voice dropped to a low, dangerous drawl. Then you'll have to go through me, and I don't reckon you're ready for that. Willa stepped into the doorway beside Jonas, her presence defiant. She didn't say a word, but her eyes blazed like wildfire. Cyrus shifted his weight. You gonna fight me in the snow like some storybook hero if that's what it takes? One of the company men reached for his coat, and Calder had the rifle aimed before the movement finished. Don't, he warned. There are laws out here even if you boys think they don't apply to you. Jonas stepped forward, then not behind Calder but beside him. I'm not yours, he said to Cyrus loud and steady. You don't get to show up now just 'cause someone waved money at you. You ungrateful, you threw me away. Jonas cut in, voice rising. You left me in that place to die. I ain't dying here. Cyrus stared at him. For a second, he looked like a man hearing a ghost speak. We'll come back, the company man muttered, stepping back. With a warrant and men who don't talk first. Calder didn't move the rifle until they rode out of sight. The snow covered their tracks, slow, but not slow enough for Calder's liking. Inside the cabin, Jonas sank to the floor, hands shaking. He was really gonna take me. No, Calder said, kneeling beside him. He tried, but he didn't. That means something. Fern Tallfeather arrived by noon, having heard through back-channel whispers that something was coming. She brought word from the county judge an injunction had been filed, challenging the adoption, and a hearing was scheduled in 3 days' time. The mine had hired outside attorneys. Real ones. They're throwing everything they've got at this, Fern said. Cyrus wants a payout for the boy, and the company wants to make an example out of you. Then they'll get an example, Calder muttered, standing. Otis arrived later with maps and documents. He'd once worked survey crews and knew the territory better than most. They're pushing lines, changing names, making ghosts out of kids, he said. But I've got proof, and I've still got friends in the records office. They huddled through the night in the cabin planning. Fern wrote affidavits. Otis pored through deeds. Willa prepared food while Jonas sat quiet, processing it all. That night, Calder found him sitting alone by the fence post. Cold, Calder said. Jonas didn't answer. You scared? Jonas nodded. Yeah, that's all right. Just don't let fear pick your path. That's all they want, to make you run. Jonas looked up at him. What if the judge says I gotta go back? Then I'll walk with you into every courtroom until somebody with a soul listens. Jonas leaned against him, small and warm. I wish you were my blood. I don't need blood to call you mine. The moon overhead lit up the land like silver fire. The wind calmed for once, but tension lingered in every breath. In the morning, the sheriff sent word that a writ had been delivered to the courthouse. The judge who'd helped them had been reassigned. A new one friendly to Consolidated was now handling the hearing. They're tightening the noose, Fern said. Then we cut the rope, Calder replied. He rode into town that afternoon, hat pulled low coat, dusted with snow. He met with the new judge, handed over the affidavits, the records Otis had unearthed. He left the courthouse with no promise, but he left seen. As he passed through the general store, folks stepped out of his way, some out of respect, some out of fear. One old miner nodded at him. You keeping that boy safe? I am. Good. We've all seen too many not make it. When Calder returned to the cabin, Jonas was waiting on the porch with a letter in his hands. It's from June, he said. She's coming to testify. Says she knows what he did to me. She says the world should hear it. Calder took the letter, eyes skimming the graceful loops of her script. That'll help. The boy nodded, jaw tight. She says, I'm more than what he did. You are. Jonas looked toward the horizon. I'm not running, he whispered. Not this time. Calder stood beside him, rifle across his back. Neither am I. The storm they feared was gathering, but this time they weren't alone. You're not saving a boy. You're staring down a system that thinks poor folks are disposable. The courthouse in San Isidro wasn't built for drama. Just one dusty room with warped floorboards, a cracked flag above the judge's bench, and pew-like benches that groaned under the weight of worn-out men and women. But that morning, it felt like every soul in town had shown up to witness the storm about to break. Calder adjusted his collar fingers, trembling only slightly as he stood by Jonas's side. The boy wore his best shirt, which still had a tear near the elbow despite Willa's careful mending. His hands clenched tight and his lap jaw set hard. Behind them sat Fern, her braid pinned back in a no-nonsense coil, and Otis with his battered briefcase resting on his knees. Across the aisle, Cyrus lounged in his seat like he already owned the outcome. The two company lawyers, sleek as otters and twice as slippery, whispered back and forth, shuffling papers. When the new judge walked in, a man named Bellamy, clean-shaven and city-dressed, Cyrus smirked. Court began. Today's hearing concerns a petition to reverse the adoption of one Jonas Gant by Mr. Calder Harlow. Judge Bellamy began, voice-clipped, eyes unreadable. Petitioner claims the adoption was obtained through fraudulent means and seeks restoration of parental rights. Objection. Fern stood immediately. The biological father relinquished those rights years ago, Your Honor, when he surrendered the child to a private mining contract. We have records, dates, and witness statements. Let's hear both sides. The judge replied, not unkindly, but not warmly either. Cyrus was called first. He swaggered to the stand, took the oath with a smirk, and spoke like a man who'd rewritten his own sins. I made mistakes, he said. But I came back. That's more than most fathers do. Blood calls to blood. You sold your son, Fern said sharply during cross-examination. You left him underground with no food, no coat, and no care. I didn't sell him, Cyrus barked. I placed him, thought it'd toughen him up. Jonas flinched. And when he ran, when you never searched for him, what was that love? Fern's voice cracked like a whip. Cyrus bristled, but the judge raised his hand. Let's keep this civil. Otis was next. He presented the maps, the contracts, the notarized letters from men who'd worked with Cyrus. All of it pointed to one thing: Consolidated Copper wanted Jonas because he was a symbol. A property dispute in a boy's body. And Cyrus was more than willing to play their pawn if the price was right. They're not here for custody, Otis said, voice rising. They're here for precedent. They want to prove that money can erase paper, that landowners and men like Calder don't matter when copper veins run underneath their boots. You're not saving a boy, he added, turning toward the judge. You're staring down a system that thinks poor folks are disposable. Willa came in quietly at the back of the room just as Jonas was called. Calder stood when he did, ready to walk with him, but the boy shook his head. I got this, Jonas said, voice low but firm. He walked to the witness stand alone. He sat straight. And when the questions came, he didn't dodge. He left me in that shaft, Jonas said, eyes locked on the judge. I ate rats. I slept with my back to the wall. If it weren't for Calder, I'd still be there or dead. What about now? The lawyer asked. Do you feel this man has manipulated you into saying these things, provided for you in a way that makes you dependent? I feel like I have a home, Jonas replied. I feel like I have worth. Judge Bellamy nodded slowly. Thank you, son. That's all. Just before the court adjourned for lunch, the back doors creaked open. June. She stepped in, wrapped in a shawl, her red hair dull with dust, but her eyes fierce. The judge eyed her curiously as Fern stood again. "Your Honor, we have one final witness." He allowed it. June took the stand, her fingers shaking slightly as she held the Bible. "I worked at the shaft where Jonas was left," she said. "I was 15. I cleaned bandages, boiled water. I saw what Cyrus did to him, the bruises, the chains, the hunger." She turned to Cyrus, eyes narrowing. "He's not a father. He's a butcher." "Objection," the company lawyer shouted. "Sustained," the judge warned. "Stick to facts." "I am," she said. "Fact, I watched that boy cry until he couldn't speak. Fact, I heard Cyrus say, he'll come back when he's hungry enough. Fact, if you give him custody again, you're sentencing Jonas to a life no child should ever endure." Her voice cracked. "He deserves love. He deserves peace." And Calder gave him both. The courtroom went still. Even Cyrus didn't smile. Court recessed for deliberation. The bench emptied. The crowd began to murmur and shuffle, but Calder didn't move. He stood by Jonas, a hand on his shoulder, anchoring him. Outside, the wind picked up again. A storm was gathering on the horizon, the sky swollen and dark with the threat of sleet. But no one left. Not yet. An hour later, Judge Bellamy returned. His face was hard to read, but his tone was steady. "This court finds that the adoption of Jonas Gant by Calder Harlow was lawful binding and done in the best interest of the child. The petition to reverse custody is hereby denied." Gasps rippled. Jonas stared at the floor, then at Calder as if trying to believe it was real. Cyrus rose slowly. "This ain't over," he muttered. "No," Calder said quietly. "It's just beginning. Without you." Cyrus walked out, fists clenched, the company men trailing behind him. Jonas stayed rooted. Then June stepped forward, pressing a small, folded note into the boy's hand. "You're free now," she said. "Don't waste it." Outside, townsfolk nodded as they passed. No fanfare, no celebration. Just quiet approval. Jonas stood on the courthouse steps beside Calder. He unfolded the note June had given him. It was one sentence. "You were always worth saving." The boy closed his eyes, the wind tugging at his coat. He didn't cry. He didn't need to. He'd been heard. He'd been chosen. And now he was home. He may have lost a war, but he still held the land his son played on, and no one could put a price on that. The days after the trial came with a quiet that felt sacred. No horns blew, no church bells rang, but everyone in San Isidro knew the dust had finally settled. Jonas was Calder's son now, by law, by blood, if not by birth, and by something deeper than either choice. The morning sun had melted away the last crusts of frost on the high pastures when Calder rose early and saddled Larkspur. He left a note for Willa, simple, just a line that read, "Going to check the west fence." But she knew where he was going. Everyone did. He rode for the North Ridge instead, the one overlooking the dry stream bed that had once separated his land from the disputed mining line. The same one Consolidated Copper had claimed was theirs for decades. But now, with Cyrus gone and their plans unraveling in the courts, thanks to Fern's relentless work, the company had gone quiet. The land beneath Calder's boots had stayed his. He stood at the edge of that bluff, the wind threading through the tall golden grass. His hat cast a shadow across his face, but his eyes tracked every familiar outline, the curve of the hills, the lean of the cottonwoods in the hollow, the weather-worn fence posts like soldiers still holding the line. The ranch had been in his family 3 generations, and while there'd been drought loss and lean years, it had never been truly threatened the way it had been this past winter. He crouched and ran his fingers through the dirt. "Still yours," he whispered. Behind him, hooves crunched. He turned to see Jonas on his pony legs, still short, but shoulders more squared than they'd ever been. He had June's note folded in the pocket of his flannel shirt, carried close like a lucky charm. "You always come up here alone," Jonas said, swinging down from the saddle. "Used to," Calder replied. "Not anymore, I reckon." Jonas dropped beside him, picking at the grass. "This where you decided to fight him?" Calder nodded slowly. "Partly here, partly in town, mostly in my gut." The boy was quiet a moment. "Are they really gone, the company?" "They're limping," Calder said. "Takes time for a snake to realize it's dying." Jonas looked out over the ridge. "It's pretty up here. Best view on the whole ranch," Calder agreed. "My daddy used to say this was the spot where you could hear the land breathe." "Can't hear nothing," Jonas said. Calder smiled. "That's how you know it's breathing just fine." They sat a while longer. Calder pulled a tin from his coat and handed the boy a piece of jerky. Jonas chewed thoughtfully. "You think he'll come back?" he asked. Cyrus Jonas nodded. Calder's jaw set. "If he does, he'll find the law waiting." "And me?" Jonas didn't say more, but his eyes flicked toward the horizon as if testing its promises. When he finally stood, he brushed his palms on his jeans. "I want to help rebuild the lower barn," he said. Calder arched a brow. "That's so I want to earn my keep." "You already have," Calder said. Jonas shook his head. "I want to earn it again." Calder stood with him, resting a hand on his shoulder. "Then we start tomorrow." That evening the house smelled of cornbread and simmering beans. Willa bustled around the kitchen, while Fern sat by the stove rubbing salve into her tired hands. Otis in from Las Cruces brought legal papers that confirmed the final withdrawal of Consolidated's land claim. He didn't stay long, just long enough to shake Calder's hand and tip his hat to Jonas. After supper, Fern brought out a map, one she'd drawn herself, carefully red inking the boundaries, now that the court had ruled in Calder's favor. "You're holding more than land," she said, as she smoothed it out on the table. "You're holding proof they can be beaten." Calder stared at the new lines, clean and true. "He may have lost a war," he murmured, "but he still held the land his son played on, and no one could put a price on that." Willa leaned in beside him. "You fought with more than grit, Calder. You fought with hope, and you gave him a place to grow." Jonas looked up from the corner where he was oiling his boots. "You gave me more than that," he said. "You gave me my name." Outside, the wind had died. Spring wasn't here yet, but the chill had softened. Somewhere out in the dark, the cows shifted in their pens, and a whip-poor-will called from the trees. Calder folded the map, slid it back into its case, and rested his hand atop it. He thought of his father, of the lean years, of the nights he'd prayed with his back against the wall, wondering if the fight was worth it. It had been. Because the land had stayed his. Because the boy had stayed his. And in the silence of that farmhouse, Calder Harlow finally breathed easy. The educational lesson learned from this story is that doing the right thing often begins with a small, quiet choice made long before anyone is watching or applauding. It reminds us that family is not only defined by blood or paperwork, but by showing up, standing firm, and offering protection when someone is most vulnerable. The story also teaches that age and hardship do not lessen our ability to make a difference. In fact, life experience can become our greatest strength when guided by compassion. Finally, it gently affirms that when we defend dignity and fairness even against powerful forces, we leave the world a little safer than we found it.